Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. In this segment, we're going to talk about dark money and politics. There is a recent article up at Truthout.org. Billionaire's lawsuit against Beto O'Rourke may stifle criticism of money and politics. The lawsuit shows the oligarchic desire to wield political influence without being subject to public accountability. The authors of the piece are Steve Macek, whom we just spoke with in the first segment, professor of communication and media studies at North Central College, co-coordinator of Project Censored's campus affiliate program. He is joined by Lee Roth, the associate director of Project Censored, co-coordinator of the campus affiliates program. He's former faculty member in sociology at Citrus College, Pomona College, and Sonoma State University. And he's also co-editor of Project Censored's State of the Free Press 2023. Steve Macek is a longtime contributor to Project Censored. Gentlemen, welcome back to the Project Censored Show.
Thanks so much, Mickey.
Thanks, Mickey. Yeah, great to be with you.
It's great to have you both here. And you start your article talking about a recent Texas lawsuit has opened a new front in the ongoing battle over the reign of money in politics, making it a prime example of how wealthy individuals and mighty corporations seek to wield political influence while avoiding public accountability. So, Andy, do we want to start off with you and get some of the facts on the case here?
Sure. This is in reference to a lawsuit being brought by Kelsey Warren, a Texas billionaire whose fortune derives from gas and oil pipelines. And Warren is bringing a suit against Beto O'Rourke that goes back to events that occurred when O'Rourke was running to challenge Greg Abbott for the seat of governor of Texas. And to kind of set the history of this, during that campaign, O'Rourke was outspokenly critical of both Greg Abbott and Kelsey Warren for actions or inaction, as the case may be, that dated back to the February 2021 winter ice storm that hit Texas. Winter Storm Uri, as it came to be known, cut the power for more than 4.5 million Texas residents. It led to several hundred deaths. A BuzzFeed report in May of 2021 disputed the official state totals of the death toll of the storm. And that storm also produced $2.4 billion in profits for Kelsey Warren's company, Energy Transfer Partners, one of many energy providers that made windfall profits as a result of the deadly winter storm in February 2021. So on the campaign trail, Beto O'Rourke was critical of both Warren and Warren's company and energy providers in Texas more generally for profiteering off of this disaster, and also critical of Governor Greg Abbott for basically letting these energy companies off the hook. There was a loophole that allowed natural gas companies like Energy Transfer to opt out of any kind of future efforts to winterize energy infrastructure. Things, in other words, measures that would reduce the likelihood of a future disaster like the one that took place in early 2021. O'Rourke was critical of that. But what he was most critical of on the campaign trail was that shortly after the governor signed this legislation with its loophole for some of the energy providers who profited off of the disaster, Kelsey Warren, the Texas billionaire, made a huge donation, one of many political donations Warren's made, but Warren specifically made a huge donation to Greg Abbott. And O'Rourke called this out as an example of kind of payback for legislation that was beneficial to his company. So, as you point out in the onset here, so Warren now is suing O'Rourke claiming that O'Rourke's criticisms defamed him, Warren, and caused him, Warren, mental anguish. So that's sort of the terms of the lawsuit itself. And what Steve and I are doing in the article that Truthout published is looking at what we see to be some of the likely trajectory of the case, but also situating this case as you characterize it. The key issue of the case is, can individuals, extremely wealthy individuals, use their wealth to basically silence their critics and avoid public accountability? So in the Truthout piece that Steve and I published, we're thinking about the Kelsey Warren's case against O'Rourke against a larger backdrop of the role of money in politics, and how money in politics can not only distort the political process, but also erode public faith in the political process.
Well, Andy Lee Roth, you mentioned mental anguish. Warren's claimed the mental anguish. I think Ted Cruz's dog would have a better case of that when he went cruising off to Cancun during the disaster, but that's another show. Steve Macek, can you add to some of the dimension there? Andy just left us with really, just a wide open issue, and Project Censored for years has been covering these issues of dark money in politics, or money and corruption in politics, paying to play, paying for favors. Much of this does look like legalized bribery, but to flip it around and actually have a lawsuit about it against O'Rourke for saying nothing really inaccurate, chime in here a little bit and talk a little bit more maybe about the background, about the law and the SLAPP cases in general, and maybe just talk about what a SLAPP case is. Some of our listeners may not know. Steve Macek.
So sorry. We argue in this article that this lawsuit by Warren is a classic example of what's called a SLAPP, a strategic lawsuit against public participation. This is when usually a wealthy individual or a corporation brings a civil suit against somebody for what is First Amendment protected political expression. Oftentimes, I'll just sort of put this in a little bit of context. This isn't, of course, the first SLAPP suit that has ever been brought. This is a tried and true tactic by corporations and wealthy individuals who oftentimes are fighting against media organizations who are trying to kind of hold them accountable for actions that they might take that may be harmful to the public. So, some of your listeners may remember the famous lawsuit that was brought by a group of cattle ranchers against Oprah Winfrey because she ran a segment on her show called Dangerous Food, where she talked about the possibility that mad cow disease might be tainting the U.S. beef supply. And on the show, she said, I'll never eat another hamburger again. And these cattle ranchers brought a lawsuit basically saying that she had defamed beef, the food beef. More recently, or actually, even before that, there was quite a famous lawsuit brought by apple growers in the state of Washington over a segment that ran on 60 Minutes, drawing attention to the fact that some of the pesticides that were used on apple trees in Washington might be carcinogenic. Those are the kinds of SLAPP suits that we're most used to. Oftentimes these actions are brought in court not because the plaintiff has any real reasonable hope of success. They're doing it mainly to first of all force the defendants to shell out huge amounts of money in legal fees, to tie them up in court, and to sort of harass them using the legal system, right? What's unprecedented, I think, about the Warren case is this is not being brought against a media organization, right? Or journalists who are normally the targets of SLAPP suits. This is being brought against a politician who was on the campaign trail making speeches, on the campaign trail, engaging in what is classic First Amendment protected speech. If the First Amendment protects anything at all, it protects the speech of political candidates criticizing their opponents on the campaign trail. So it is really stunning. In the article, Andy and I, make the argument that this is very likely, as just on its face, as a defamation suit, unlikely to succeed. And it's unlikely to succeed for a number of reasons. First of all, in any under Texas law, a defense against defamation, one defense against defamation is truth. If the charges that O'Rourke was making on the campaign trail were true, then Warren cannot really claim damages. And all of the facts that are available to the public seem to point to the conclusion that the charges he was making about influence buying, about Warren buying influence with Abbott to get special favor for Energy Transfer Partners, his company, were true. Second, it was very clear that when he was using terms like bribery, which he did use on the campaign trail, that it was his opinion, and his opinion of Warren. You cannot claim damages for derogatory subjective opinions, right? So, just because somebody has a derogatory subjective opinion of you doesn't mean you can sue them for that, especially if it is clear that is a subjective opinion.
Or does it mean that you can sue them but not win?
You can sue them, right? You can sue them but not win.
So what's the purpose here?
Right. So and then the final thing I just want to say is that that according to the legal definition, right, of a public figure as it's been established in the case law, going back to New York Times v. Sullivan and Gertz v. Welsh, two important cases that sort of defined, that sort of set limits to the kind of damages or the ability of public figures or elected officials to claim damages in defamation suits. According to their definition, Warren is clearly a public figure. Because he's somebody with general fame or notoriety in the community, with a pervasive involvement in the ordering of the affairs of society. As such, in order to be able to get damages from O'Rourke, Warren would have to prove that O'Rourke deliberately spread falsehoods designed to defame him. That is, that he engaged in actual malice. And there's no evidence at all of that. So we don't think the lawsuit is likely to prevail in court. However, that isn't the point, as we argue in the piece. The point is not to actually win in court. It is to force O'Rourke to hire lawyers to defend him. It is to tie him up in court. And it is to muddy the issues that he was speaking about, right, in the public eye. It's not, it is, and it's also to intimidate anybody else who may want to make criticisms of Warren. People are going to think twice about criticizing him or his company, knowing that they could be hit with one of these SLAPP suits.
Well, Steve Macek, I just wanted to point out for our listeners, both you and Andy Lee Roth cite Gertz v. Welsh in your Truthout article from 1974, and you literally quoted it from the article and from the case defining this. And then, of course, you point out that when I interjected a little bit ago, the purpose isn't necessarily to win. And then you all go on to talk about how Warren may win even if he loses these cases. And we'll talk more about that. And we'll talk more about dark money in politics after this brief musical break. I'd like to remind our listeners, you're tuned to the Project Censored Show. I'm Mickey Huff, your host. We're speaking with Andy Lee Roth and Steve Macek. We're discussing a recent article at truthout.org. A billionaire's lawsuit against Beto O'Rourke may stifle criticism of money in politics. We'll continue that conversation after, again, this brief musical break. Stay with us. 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. In this segment today, we are still speaking with Dr. Steve Macek from North Central College, and we are also joined by the Associate Director of Project Censored, Dr. Andy Lee Roth. They are both authors of a recent article at Truthout.org looking at dark money and politics, specifically citing a case going on in Texas, a billionaire's lawsuit against Beto O'Rourke, and how it may stifle criticism of money in politics. And before the break, Steve Macek, you were outlining for us, you both and Andy were outlining what the case is, what the issue with SLAPP suits happen to be. But then Steve Macek, you ended by saying that Warren may even win just by tying Beto O'Rourke up in court. So I leave it to you, gentlemen. Andy, do you want to come in here and talk a little bit more about some of the broader issues with this?
Thanks. Just sticking to the issues of the Warren case for a moment. This is Texas, and in effect, Warren is playing the equivalent of a high-stakes game of Texas Hold'em poker. He doesn't have much of a hand, right? His cards are crummy for all the reasons that Steve outlined a moment ago. But if he can bluff with that hand and get O'Rourke to fold, the chilling effect, shifting now from poker metaphors to press metaphors, the chilling effect will be significant. He may lose in court, but still win the larger battle, where the larger battle is this issue that the big frame for this story is, what's at stake when wealthy individuals and powerful corporations attempt to use their wealth and their influence to stifle public criticism and therefore avoid public accountability for their conduct, right? Those are ultimately, without much further explanation, straightforward, counter-democratic outcomes, right? They go against the grain of everything we understand about a nation under rule of law and democratic processes. And that's exactly where kind of an analysis of SLAPPs, these strategic lawsuits against public participation, is possible or is important, right? Because as the founders of that concept, a sociologist, Penelope Kanan, and a law professor, George Pring, wrote way back in 1988 when they coined the term, they defined SLAPPs in terms of attempts to use civil tort action to stifle political expression. So the whole point is that the aim is to stifle political expression, right? To reduce the likelihood that people will speak out. And this is, as Steve's pointed out, typically SLAPPs are drawn against, are registered against media outlets and journalists. And one of the things that's novel in this case is in effect an escalation of how SLAPPs are used to affect public discourse, is that this time the SLAPP, Kelsey Warren's case, defamation suit, is being used to target a political candidate.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah, please do, Steve Macek.
And add just a couple of other pieces of context that we make reference to in the piece. What's interesting about this, that Warren is bringing what is clearly a strategic lawsuit against public participation, is that Texas is one of 28 states in the country that has an anti-SLAPP law. So there is a law in the books in Texas. It's called the Texas Citizen Participation Act, which gives defendants of these frivolous SLAPP actions the ability to request that the case be dismissed on the grounds that they're being sued because of their First Amendment protected speech. So there is this law on the books already that O'Rourke can use to protect himself against this suit. What's also even more interesting to me about this is that since Abbott has become governor, there's been an effort at the state legislature to water down and kind of render toothless the Texas Citizen Participation Act. So really interestingly, there's a group called Texans for Lawsuit Reform, I believe, which is a suit, a group of that's a front group for a bunch of powerful corporations that want to do what conservatives call tort reform. They want to make changes to the law to put limits on the amount of damages that ordinary citizens can claim in the event of being like injured because of pollution or a defective product or whatever. So they basically want to water down the tort laws in the state of Texas. This group you think would be, in favor of a SLAPP law, but instead they've been lobbying to kind of render it more toothless. Nevertheless, the efforts at the state legislature, which have passed to kind of limit the scope and effectiveness of the Texas Citizen Participation Act, probably are not going to affect O'Rourke's ability to use this. I mean, what the reform did was it said that in order to have a SLAPP suit dismissed, the defendant has to demonstrate that their claim for it being dismissed is based on their First Amendment speech and association rights rather than simply related to them. But in this case, we don't think that this is really going to affect O'Rourke's ability to ask for an immediate dismissal under this law. But I do think it's ironic that there are these powerful forces that want to water down these anti-SLAPP laws, and especially this one in the case of Texas, the Texas Citizen Participation Act.
You also point out in the article, when you're discussing how Warren may win even if he loses, you do mention a UK-based foreign policy center that discusses about how 70% of surveyed journalists reported facing legal threats. I mean, so this is how common is this practice?
Oh, incredibly common, and as that report makes clear, it's much more common in certain other countries that do not have anti-SLAPP laws. So Britain, the UK, is sort of ground zero for SLAPP suits being brought against investigative journalists. Corporations, corrupt oligarchs, and so on, who are being investigated for various kinds of corruption, will bring their lawsuits in London because it is such a favorable environment for bringing a defamation lawsuit. And of course, we're familiar with this here. I mean, there have been lots of famous cases like the Westmoreland case where people wanting to sue U.S. journalists for defamation have brought lawsuits over in England against Americans, have brought lawsuits in England or in the UK against US based media organizations just because they happen to have like a British edition so that they can more easily bring a defamation suit. So this is something that we're very familiar with, but it is very alarming that the report found that so many reporters involved in reporting on things like the Panama Papers and others, other international financial scandals, have been subjected to this kind of legal harassment.
So legal harassment, it does require deep pockets to be able to file these suits, and we're back to the issue of money in politics. So back to you, Andy Lee Roth. This is something that we've covered at Project Censored for some time, the dark money issue in politics. Could you take us out and maybe talk about some of the bigger pictures in Citizens United about some of these affairs?
Yeah, we have, as listeners of this program may know, the Project Censored top 25 story list for the past year includes no fewer than 3 stories about dark money. So these are stories that are important but underreported in the corporate media. Where Steve and I leave off in the Truthout article about the Warren lawsuit against O'Rourke is to try to understand this SLAPP suit against the backdrop of dark money in politics, where the common denominator of the two is an effort to use money to avoid public scrutiny, right? To use money to exert influence without being subject to public scrutiny or critique. So dark money, political spending by individuals and organizations that aren't required that aren't required to disclose their individual donors has a corrosive effect on not only politics, as I've said earlier, but also on public trust in government and especially elections. And we know, as State of the Free Press 2023, the latest censored yearbook went to press, we know that there were at least a dozen states that were either considering legislation or had passed legislation that would actually make it more difficult for investigative journalists and other public interest groups to expose dark money contributions. So in effect, making dark money darker. And I think the same principle, there's the connecting principle, the ruthless connecting principle here between dark, states making it more difficult to disclose dark money in politics, and the Warren lawsuit against O'Rourke is this oligarchic desire to wield influence without being subject to political public criticism or accountability. And both of those, as I've said previously, are fundamentally counter-democratic sensibilities.
Yeah, indeed. And that's the voice of Andy Lee Roth, Associate Director of Project Censored. Steve Macek, any final words from you as we round out this segment? Again, this is a very important story and unfortunately ongoing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, as you say, unfortunately ongoing. It is just one of the many ways in which people with very deep pockets, the powerful, the wealthy, giant corporations are able to evade public accountability, right? They can do it through bringing these SLAPP lawsuits. They can do it by using dark money, unaccountable, invisible, hard to trace money to lobby for laws in state legislatures and in Congress. They can do it by using dark money to fund attack ads attacking political candidates, or as we saw during the recent Supreme Court confirmation hearings, to attack nominees for judgeships. It is brought about a crisis in democracy in this country, and it's no wonder that year in and year out, among the stories that Project Censored has identified as the least well covered by the corporate media, the most ignored, are stories that have to do with the nefarious influence of dark money over political life.
That's the voice of Steve Macek, Professor of Communication and Media Studies at North Central College, co-coordinator of Project Censored's campus affiliate program. Before that, Andy Lee Roth, the Associate Director of Project Censored, also co-coordinator of the campus affiliate program. They were co-authors of a piece at truthout.org, published January 28th. You can go to truthout.org to see it. Billionaire's lawsuit against Beto O'Rourke may stifle criticism of money in politics. Andy Lee Roth, Steve Macek, thank you so much for joining us today on the Project Censored Show.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mickey.